almost 25 years.
Sorry about
Almost
that.
25 years. I have a master's degree in social work. I have a PhD in social work in 2020. I worked with a lot of different populations. And so that's just a little bit about me. Next slide. I have to give this disclaimer because I do work for the Department of the Air Force. These are my views alone. And so I just wanted to put this disclaimer out here so you will know. Next slide. And so the first part, and I am a little ADHD, so I'm going to go through some of this. And if you have any questions, please feel free. I'll stop and allow you to ask any questions after I give some of the information. So the first part of this study was, I attended a psychodynamic school, which means that they believe in a lot of bit about relational, less in terms of the behavioral aspects of people, more or less CBT, more psychodynamic. And so we really wanted to explore the lived experiences of people who've had weight loss surgery. Many people hadn't explored these things from the research that I got. And so that was one of the things, but I also wanted to know about their attachments. So I did interviews and I also did a study of the ECRS structure, which is an attachment pattern thing. Next slide. Survey, sorry. And so I looked at these, when I analyzed the information, I looked through with attachment theory, which is secure attachment, dismissive attachment, and I'll go in a little bit more into that. But then also affect regulation, how you regulate your mood, and also relational therapy, how you relate to other people, especially your primary attachment, your mother, your father, the people who raised you. Next slide. And so it looks like there was no other research in the field about this. And so this is one of the things that I was very much into. I have to admit, when I think of bed, I am African-American descent. I had a hard time with that part of the research because I'm thinking everybody I know is overweight, most people, Black people that I know don't have bed. That's more of a Western white culture thing. And so that was one of the things that was surprising about it. The binge eating, which is eating without control or, having excessive amount of calories. So I did this, it was a qualitative, a mixed method. And so my research is to bridge the gap. Next slide. So I recruited people by doing a flyer. I even think I had a participant from Guam, but unfortunately she fell through. But that was one of the participants, the flyer that I sent out. Next slide. And so here are the criteria and the research. I had 12 participants. Prior to the meeting, I sent the survey out, and then they returned it with the release and the demographics. And then I collected all their information, and then we set up a meeting where I scored, prior to meeting with them, I scored the relationship scoring, and then we talked about it when we met with them again. Next slide. And so most of the place was convenient. We did, because of the somewhat of where I was in life, I was actually in Guam through some of the interviews. So we did do some interviews online and over video. And so I recorded the interview. I also video recorded and audio recorded. And so those are some of the platforms that I use. Next slide. And so I use, I'm not good with transcribing. So in order to transcribe the script, I emailed to this program called rev.com, which transcribed my script, and then I re-listened to it. Next slide. And so I got permission from Mr. Farley, who is the the inventor of the ECRRS. And so he works at the University of Illinois. I am from Illinois, so it was really good. And I was able to hand score all of the people. Next slide. And so, like I said, I did a narrative. I listened to stories. I'm very much from an oral tradition in my family. So this was right up my alley. And so we listened to stories about how people and understood the context to draw some conclusions. Next slide. And so my primary research questions were, what are your lived experience and how did your relationships impact it? The other thing is, the other secondary questions were, how did your relationship styles affect your decision to have the surgery? And how did it affect whether you felt your surgery was a success and failure? Next slide. And so, like I said, I interviewed on those 2 points. And so this was pretty much the structure. Next slide. And so I started out with, who raised you? What was your parents' relationship like? What was the role of food in your family? In my family, food was very important. When I was sad, my mom would give me food. When I was happy, my mom would give me food. And so that was one of the things that I wanted to tease out from people. Next slide. And so collecting the data and talking about their stress and making sure that they were able to tell their stories was very important to me in terms of the collection. So next slide. And so here's some of the demographics that I had. I had 6 men, 6 women. The majority of them were 30 and older. I had one person in their 20s. I think he was 29. And then I had 6 African Americans, 3 Caucasian, 2 Latinos, and 1 biracial person. They all were United States citizens. They all spoke English. 2 were single. And then the rest were either in a long, 1 was divorced, 3 were single, and then 9 of them were married or in a long-term relationship. Then the length of the relationships varied. One was married for 30 years and plus, and then there was a lot of variations in terms of relationship. And then the locations, California, Florida, Illinois, Tennessee. Next slide. And so here's some information about their weight history, the ages of when most of them, the majority was under 25. They were overweight. That's when the first time that they had, some people became overweight after getting pregnant. And so that's when they started it. And then some of their weight goals. Most of the people lost between 125 pounds to 325 pounds. And so in the bottom, we talk a little bit about people gaining weight. A lot of people kept their weight off after having the surgery. 4 people had not gained any weight. Next slide. And so here's some medical conditions, because of course, obesity is the primary, but then it leads to the following medical conditions. And so a lot of people, their sleep apnea, their high blood pressure, those things were eliminated. And then some of them either, once you have congestive heart failure, it's really hard to kind of, once the damage is done. But some of the basics like the high blood pressure and the diabetes were eliminated after the surgery. And so some of those things. Next slide. And so here is what the results from the ECRR. Many of them told me that they had secure attachments with their mothers. 10, and then 2 people said they had dismissive attachments. Secure attachment is when you feel like you can come and go, you don't feel smothered, you're independent. A dismissive attachment is you kind of are afraid to tell your parents how you're feeling, what's going on. A fearful one is you're afraid they're going to leave you. preoccupied one is similar to the fearful one, you're afraid, but it's more that you're preoccupied with that relationship. And so a lot of them, you see a little bit of variance in terms of their romantic partners and their friendships. And so it was very interesting to see this. Next slide. Now, here's some demographics of each one and the age range and how long they had surgery. Next slide. And so here's a part of the themes of the interview. One of the things that I found was many of them said they had secure attachments with their parents, but then when they started going into the interviews with their mom and dad, they started telling me stories of relational traumas. Now, people mostly think of trauma as something where, something happens like sexual assault or combat trauma. But we now know with the ACE study or the ACE scores, which I will get into, people's parents going to jail, different things, parents being depressed, those also are traumas that many children face in our community and we don't address. And so here are some of the themes that they talked about. They talked about their relationship with their caregivers, their partners, or siblings. They loved me when, before the surgery, they loved me when I was fat, I had a role in my family. And then after, it was all about me, when they chose the surgery, it was all about me. I had to deal with my weight and how to keep my self-esteem off. But then they also talked about the cost of being overweight and how your health care, traveling was so much more. And then also after the surgery, a new me, learning new tools, understanding my new good life, having a total new mindset or picking up new addictions. And then also redefining their attachment. Am I good enough? And, a lot of times they would get more attention. And then the reset and the failures in the reset. Next slide. And so in the next section, I just wanted to know, I wanted to stop here because I will go over in the next section some of the discussion of what the results were. And then also I have a case study that I found fascinating that I found online. And it kind of draws a parallel to my research and the Chamorro people. And so I really want to talk about that. But I wanted to know if I wanted to open up and anybody wants to open up and ask me any questions. Not at this time? Okay. All right. Wonderful. Okay. Okay. So the next part, next slide. So in the discussion, I'm going to talk about it through a lens of attachment, affect disorder, and affect regulation, and relational dynamics. Next slide. And so here are the different types of attachment styles that adult attachments can have. Secure, like I said, that's where you feel secure in your relationship. You don't feel fearful or worried or anything like that. And then there's the fearful attachment that they're going to leave you. The dismissive attachment, that's where you're so worried about them leaving you that you kind of just shut them off. You shut off your feelings around. And so that's the dismissive attachment. And then the preoccupied attachment is, I love you, I hate you. I love you, I hate you. There's that ambivalence to that. And so those are kind of the definitions of those. Next slide. And so, like I said, these were the scores that I got. Many of them had a solid attachment to their mother. And what was interesting, like I said, the stories differed from what they had on the scores, which was my first finding. Next slide. And so the narratives were different. And what I found was, now that they're older, yes, they do have an attachment to their parents. They're more closer to their attachment. And so the ECRS, the survey, they could be explicit, but when I interviewed, I had to get more detail. And so it was the difference between using the instrument, which I think also talks about the fact that, many of surveys are done with, pen and paper, and there's no follow-up to it. And so a lot of them, I think, didn't realize growing up, maybe they weren't as close to their parents as possible. Next slide. And so in the interview, I watched their body language, I watched their tone, I watched their situation, the attitudes, which the interview doesn't, which the pencil test doesn't give you. And so that's why I feel like it didn't support the results. The interview didn't support the results. Next slide. Many of my participants in the interview talked about, only so much I can tell my mother. This person only talked and said, I asked the question, how much do you talk to your parent growing up about your feelings? And they would say, I only could talk to my mom about so much. I was extra cautious with my mom because I was afraid, one person said, I was afraid to overwhelm her. Another person said, my father just disappeared. He'd come to work and go home and he really wasn't there, and I missed it. And another person said, he missed a lot of days with me. And they said, one said, me and my mother have never been extremely close. Next example. Next slide, I'm sorry. And so this talks about what a relational trauma is. It's many defines it as chronic exposure to misattunement, and it's a dysregulation. And so when you're in your early attachment and early relationships, you are taught how to calm and soothe yourself by both parents, or at least one parent. And many of my all of my participants talked about not having a parent to be able to go to. Many of them had grandmas and aunties that provided them the soothing, but their biological parents were not necessarily there. And so this relational trauma talks about how it's an unresolved, unconscious disconnection between their parent. And that did not allow them to be able to soothe or learn how to regulate themselves. Next slide, sorry. And so many of them talked about how food became their outlet. There was a control issue, and this is many times with people who have eating disorders, the binge eating. She was a stickler. She wanted me to eat everything on my plate. I think he took some pride that we were the biggest boys. I had a lot of issues, and me and my grandmother, with this woman, her and her grandmother would bake. And so next slide. And so that was my second finding. And so a lot of times that leads to an general transmission of insecure attachment. That's where if a family member or a parent has an insecure attachment, which they don't have a secure attachment with their parents, they will put those vulnerabilities on their own children, causing their children to have to find other ways to deal with it because maybe they found other ways. So you will see a lot of parents that are overweight and their children are overweight because those are the skill sets that they've taught them. Next slide. And so this is also another lens through attachment and talking about how people relate to their parents. A lot of times they will idealize them, or if they're dismissive, they feel disconnected, or their stories of their childhood are disconnected from what the pain was. One of my participants told me that her parents sent her to her grandparents' house from the age of like 2 years old till she was 8. And she really didn't know her mother and her brothers and sisters, and how that disconnection of being separated from her grandmother and the family that she knew and going into this family really triggered her weight gain. Next slide. And so, like I said, the relationship led to what is known as a secondary attachment strategy. It's where your body and your mind kind of disconnect. You can't handle the anxiety that you feel from not being supported or loved by your attachment figure. And so it triggers that anxiety, which you need to relieve. And so many studies, there's a lot of studies out here that are talking about how addiction is now an attachment disorder. And so Hill talks about how, if you don't know how to alleviate your anxiety, you will use a different strategy to the point where it may make you sick, but this is the only way that you can connect. And it's a level of disassociating. Next slide. And so Hill talks about how your body and your mind are connected, and how sometimes when you, someone who has a regular able to be homeostasis, keep on a balance, your body constantly wants to keep a balance. And so not being able to experience joy without food, rage without food, embarrassment without food, this is the way that people in my study managed to manage their feelings. Next slide. And so at some level, after these childhood traumas and disconnections, they had to disavow their needs. So the part of the secondary attachment is I have to put my mom, my dad, everybody else's needs before me. And so there was a disconnect between their body and their mind. And so it was due to this misattunement, not being able to verbalize this. And I see this amongst a lot of my patients now that don't know how to, understand their own needs. They're always putting other people before themselves. Next slide. And so this imbalance of this in secondary attachment, I'm theorizing, that causes a disassociated state. When we think about disassociating, it's like your brain is compartmentalizing your feelings, that little girl or boy inside of you that can't deal with the emotions. And we see this amongst children who have ADHD, people who have experienced compound traumas. Their frontal cortex sometimes are hyper aroused, or they have to calm down. Many children who have parents who are dismissive or do not deal with their feelings, sometimes they will just shut down and be like a turtle in a shell. And then there are other children, and you can see this when you see the kids. There are other kids that will act out because they want, mommy, look at me, I need your attention. And so those are there are multiple ways that children handle that. But then there's this disassociation with when they eat, of not really dealing with the feelings, and I see this more now with children and video games. And, I hate to see a 2-year-old with a phone, because that's starting that regulation. And if you see a 2-year-old and they take the phone away, they start having this, meltdown, because the phone is now providing that regulation. Next slide. And so, like I said, the misattunement with the interaction with their parents, whether they feel safe, all of this leads to a compartmentalized and unconscious emotional issue, to be able to calm themselves and learn how to calm themselves. Next slide. And so this kind of talks about, I probably should have talked a little bit about it earlier. Children have their own regulating system, and they learn from their parents a sense of self and a sense of mastery and well-being. But if a parent is not in tune, whether it be a mother or father whoever their primary caregiver, you know, if their parent is anxious, if their parent is overwhelmed, you will see that in the child, and they learn those things and they become skewed. Next slide. And so another theorist, McDougall, talks about the concept of psychic solution and affect dispel, which is the eating. You know, you have to get rid of those symptomatic issues by eating in your body. And you know, now there's a lot of mind body issues out there that people use their body to deal with their emotion. And then also the addictive solution, where your mind and your body kind of split, and these things lead to alcoholism, drug addiction, and binge eating. Next slide. And so the other theory is the transitional object. Many kids have this, they use the binky, but usually the binky gets replaced either with learning how to do it, or the pacifier, or they learn other ways to handle it. And so if they don't learn to self-soothe, they don't learn how to handle their auto-assuming thing through the relationship with their parent, a lot of times it gets thrown off. Next slide. And so here's one of the things that the surgery, so after the surgery, when you have the gastric bypass surgery or any weight loss surgery, you don't realize that your body and your mind have been disconnected. You know, that's where it's unconscious. And after the surgery, you experience a large amount of pain when you overeat. And that pain triggers, where do I deal? Thank you. Where do I deal with that emotion? One of the greatest analogies one of my participants said is that she was upset because her son got injured at a baseball game. And her first thought was to run, after she had the surgery, run to McDonald's and have a juicy quarter pounder. She gets there, she orders the food, she takes a bite and realizes that's all she could eat. And she's like, I had to learn, what can I do with these emotions? And so the food, you know, helps you to deal, the surgery causes you to learn new ways and helps you to learn to read your body. And if you don't have a supporting, and this is where spouses, family members come in, if you don't have a secure attachment with your spouse or your other family members, a lot of times it ends up you gaining weight. Many of the people who have gained some of their weight back talked about how their spouses were not supportive, or they ended up having another divorce. Next slide. And so many of them talk about an epiphany moment and how they realized that they were using food to handle their emotion, and that, you know, they didn't realize they were struggling with BED, which is binge eating disorder, or disinhibiting eating, where you just eat and you're not thinking about how much you're taking in. And so a lot of times, the majority of all of my participants, I would say, had some form of dismissive or some insecure attachment with their parents due to a childhood trauma or a trauma that happened. Each one of them had a trauma that led up to their weight loss, which was very interesting. And so they described this dismissive eating. Next slide. And so these unrelated traumas, like I said, a lot of them found that they were struggling with gaining their weight back because they didn't know what to do with the feelings. You know, one participant told him, his wife told him that she loved him more when he was overweight. And so a lot of that played a role in them gaining their weight back. Some said that they gained weight back after something happened, like the death of their parent, or the or a divorce, or, many things that happen because they didn't know how to deal with their new body and their new life. Next slide. And so in the fifth finding, we talked about how working on dealing with their body dysmorphia, dealing with trying to connect with their body and understanding that. And so there was a study, the childhood adversity study, adverse childhood experience. That was a really good study that talked about the body-mind connection to health. And that was one of the things that I think needs to be more explored. Next slide. And so some of the implications for the weight loss surgery, I do believe they need to do more pre-counseling on addiction, relational traumas, and eating disorder for pre-surgery, looking at their strategies and helping them to find new ways before they have the surgery. And then also post-surgery, doing some counseling on working on their eating, and not using eating as a defense or picking up other addictions like alcoholism, which is on the rise for eating disorder, for weight loss surgery patients, or even sexual addictions. And I think social workers can help with that management, that co-regulation. In relational theory, there is a belief that the therapist is helping to reparent, regulate the person. And so a person that's having surgery, after they have the surgery, going to therapy, talking about what they're experiencing, finding new ways to process their feelings, I think is really good. Yep. No. Next slide. All right. So identifying any past, for the social workers, identifying any past and unresolved traumas, learning how to understand your body and learn why you were eating, and learning how to detach from that, using that secondary strategy. And then also recognizing, your relationships now and how they work, that maybe led to your thing. And then reconnecting your body in your mind and listening to your body and your feelings. Next slide. Okay, so I wanted to know if anybody had any other questions about the findings. So in my research, I wanted to make this relevant to the population that I'm talking to. And so one of the things that I found fascinating is I found this case study on a survey looking at the diets and obesity among Chamorros and Filipinos on Guam. And here are the people, and I'm thankful that they did this study that did this. And so next slide. Oh. Wait a minute, let's see. What's the question? Can you just come on and ask me? I like entertain. Go back
I can't.
to the other
Oh,
slide.
okay.
There you go.
Oh, okay. Can I just read it?
Yep.
Like any idea or suggestions which you recommend, like for overeating, to stay away from overeating whenever we feel stressed?
I think the question is overeating. If you are using food.
Right. Yeah.
Yeah.
Like,
And so
use
if you,
food.
what I'm saying is I think there needs to be a real look at what does food mean to you, and how, if you turn to food when you're stressed out, why is that? And what other coping skills can you do to replace it? And so I think a lot of people use food. I think there's a lot of cultures, in this study, case study with Guam. Guam's population is very similar to the African American tradition. and we have a high obesity rates. And I think that a lot of times it's also cultural, and it's also the way we've always done it. And the question is, have you ever questioned why you're eating when you're stressed out? What do you think is the reason why people eat when they are stressed out? So any idea how to avoid overeating when you're stressed out? I think the first thing is to be able to acknowledge that you're overeating. I know for me, I struggled with admitting that I was overeating because I thought, well, this is what everybody did. And then I think being able to learn before you being mindful of what you're putting in your mouth, I think is important, because you can overeat spinach or salad, but then you can also overeat things that have no caloric value at all. And so I think that that is a part of, yeah. Well, you know what? That is correct. And so let me go into the study. Let me talk about that. I just read the question on the chat that you said that many of your participants didn't realize they may not be as close to their parents. Is because often we portray good relationships in front of other people. I think that that's true. I think that it is because that, and also a lot of times you've been told, don't talk bad about your parents. Don't say bad things about your mom and dad. And so you have to do that. But then when you realize that your parents are human and they're going to make mistakes, I have a lot of patients that I'll say, well, what was it like growing up? And they'll tell me these horrible things about their parents beating them and being cruel to them. But then I'll say, well, it sounds like it was difficult, or your mom wasn't very nice. Oh no, my mom is wonderful now, and it's like, okay. And so a lot of times people don't want to admit that they were traumatized, or these people, this is where the disconnection comes. The disassociation comes from it. No one wants to admit that their parents weren't what they needed them to be. And I'm just as guilty. I know when I was going to school, we had to do a lot of counseling. And I would say, my mom was a strong woman. She took care of us. And my teacher said, your mom was kind of a man-hating bitch and taught you not to be able to learn to have relationships. And I was like, whoa. And I was like, at first I was like, don't you talk about my mama? But then I had to, as I processed it, I was like, she did have some harsh opinions about different things due to her own trauma that she passed on to me. And so I do think that people don't want to talk about their parents in front of other people. They want to put everybody in the good light. But the reality is you won't heal until you deal with all of it. You won't heal until you have that revelation. And so I would like to go over this next slide.
Hi, Dr.
And
Burford.
yes,
Sorry to
ma'am.
interject. So just for time crunch, you have about 35 minutes left.
Okay, I'm almost done.
Okay.
Yeah.
And yeah, at the end of your presentation, we'll have a 10-minute panel for any questions or comments.
Okay, wonderful. And so I will go through this. So what was interesting about this thing, I gave a little overview and added some of the things that are in there. So we're going to talk about the collective trauma, the relational trauma, the intergenerational transmission, the unhealthy outcomes, and the comparison that the researchers made, and then the need for, I think, further research. Next slide. And so we talk about, and I actually, to be honest with you, I think it should go way back, probably when the Spaniards came to Guam and then the Americans. But I think the biggest trauma that I believe that one of the biggest traumas that the Chamorros had was the World War II and the bombing and what happened and being preoccupied by the Japanese military. Next slide. And so this was a collective trauma to be under what 31 months of under collective rule and experiencing forced labor and family separations and incarcerations and prostitute. And they say over 10% of the island's population was killed during this time. Next slide. And so, and then when the Americans came in, they were liberators. I know on the 21st of July, the island celebrates. And so but that was at a cost, because many of the way that in order to liberate people, they had to destroy communities. And then in 1950, Guam became a U.S. territory. Next slide. And so from that, from the study, it talks about the population. So 42% is Chamorro and 33% is Filipino, according to the researchers. And they talk about the body mass of the people that they talked about. Next slide. And so I know when I was in Guam, many people suffered with diabetes and high blood pressure. And a lot of it was due to the increasing being westernized and in the United States. And then it's 60% of deaths in Guam are caused by poor lifestyles and lifestyle patterns. Next slide. And this is all cited from the study. And so in their study, they had 27 people, 27 subjects that volunteered. They had people, the people that were there who were Chamorro were born and raised in Guam, while the Filipinos that participated in this slide were either born and raised in the Philippines and came afterwards. And in this study, the Chamorros had a higher BMI than the Filipinos. Next slide, I'm sorry. And so, originally in Guam, everything was plant-based, yams, fruits, fish. And then after World War II, it became high processed, canned, corned beef, banana sausage. And even to this day, I think that the fact that Guam doesn't have, isn't able, everything's monitored through the US also adds to the obesity rate. Next slide. And so in this study, it was fascinating because it talked about how there's a lot of chronic health risks and the difference between the way the Filipino population of Guam's obesity rate was much lower. And I feel that it had a lot to do, next slide, with the fact that you all experienced this trauma that was different than what the Filipino population of Guam experienced, this collective trauma. And I do believe when we talk about the transitional object, I feel in some ways, and this would be an interesting study to enter into, is that the transitional object for many is the fiesta. You think about people and how you get together and the relationship of it, and it's eating, and it's important, and it helps people to feel connected. And so that was a part of, the celebration of being liberated. Next slide. And then in terms of the secondary trauma, how many of your family members who lived through World War II had to disavow their feelings, their state, even though the United States liberated Guam, but they still colonized Guam. And so there's a level of a disinvolvement of people who are not necessarily, the fact that when I lived in Guam, I couldn't vote for president. And so you had rights without representation, and how you had to disinvolve yourself. You're Americans, you served, I worked with a lot of veterans, a lot of people in the Guard, and the idea that you serve, but you don't have the same rights. And how does that work in terms of living in your community? Next slide. And so I talk about the transitional object and the secondary attachment strategy. Next slide. I don't know, I threw that one in there, sorry. And then, like I said, they talked about the comparison of obesity between Filipinos and Chamorros. Now, they do admit that, you know, other ethnic groups encourage and have a larger rate of obesity as they become more westernized. But I do believe that there's a level, even if you look at the Japanese versus the Koreans have a more and are larger due to some of their traumas that they experience. And so first generational Filipinos were not exposed to the experiences that the Guam culture was experienced to. Next slide. And so to kind of wrap all this up, you know, I would like to see a more robust study, you know, maybe adding on a quantitative study. But for my study, I felt like the sample size was too small. So doing a study in Guam where it was a larger sample, I think would be good. And giving, and instead of using the experience of close relationship, considering using the adult attachment inventory or even the ACE study. Next slide. And the ACE study a lot of times will ask participants, were you ever physically abused by a parent, emotionally abused by a parent, sexually abused by anyone, you know, any drug or incarceration, loss of parent during that time. I think that those would be a great thing to add to any study. Next slide. And I would add to my study. So in conclusion, a lot of people, like we were saying, they don't want to talk. They want to talk in expletives. They want to be general instead of talking about their real trauma and what was going on. Also talking about the intergenerational, which led to their using food as a way to cope with their feelings and not learning how to regulate. Also that disassociated state of having to deal with not dealing with your own feelings and your own emotions and using food as a transitional object. And a lot of my patients will return, a lot of the participants will return to a secondary attachment strategy, whether it's eating, alcohol. For me, it ended up being sugary drinks, but next slide. And so in conclusion, many of my participants said that they would not, they would have had the surgery again, and that they felt like their attachment did affect how they were successful. Many of them after having the surgery were like, this was a life or death matter and I needed to do it because they had health issues. All but one said that they would do it again. In that one, it's interesting because she was the one married for the longest time. And so I just wonder, you know, and a lot of times her husband, she would admit her husband would take her to the buffets, you know, and say that he loved her when she was bigger. And so it just was a very interesting aspect. Next slide. And so part of my interest in this study is because I had gastric bypass over 21 years ago now. And I started gaining weight. I lost over 150 pounds. I was 300 pounds, lost 150 pounds. And I was able to keep it off for the first 3 years. And then I went home and lived with my mother for a while. And I found out that I started eating. Every time my mom would say something, and I love my mother, but every time she'd say something, I have food in my mouth. And actually, if you look at the picture of me as a child, I'm the one with the cracker eating the cracker, you know? And so I've always been eating. And so my mother, and then also my mother and my sister also had this surgery. My mother ended up becoming a gambler, and my sister struggled with alcoholism. And so I saw, but luckily for me, I'm a social worker, so I got a lot of therapy and I was able to kind of help keep my weight off. I have gained 75 pounds back, but I think part of that's due to age and menopause and stuff like that. But I am working through not using food to cope. and also working with other people. Next slide. Okay, so anyone have any questions?
Looks like there's no questions or comments at the moment.
Uh-oh, somebody
But
made one.
oh, okay.
What does it say? Let's see.
Okay, so it's from Frances Munoz. Frances, she said there is now a doctor on island who is providing weight loss surgery, and he is requiring his patients to seek counseling to address their unhealthy attachments to food. In order for approval, his patients are required to prove that their relationship with food is changing based on their weight loss
Oh,
prior to the
wonderful.
surgery. And dieting and not being able to use food to self-soothe, we saw insecure attachments with parents, especially with their mothers surface. We also saw that siblings from the same family had addictions to substances. Interesting material.
Right, very interesting. One of the things I wanted to know, and that's great, that's one of the things that I think is very important that they're doing that. Now, that is also my argument. Many of the doctors require counseling before the surgery, but they don't really require counseling after the surgery. And so that would be my argument to the community, is that, when you're in pain because you're overeating, and you don't know what it is, you can say in theory, oh, I'm overeating, I'm dealing with my stress, I will not use food. But if you don't help them when they're in the middle of it, it kind of is a mute point. So that's where I would say it's great that they're doing it afterwards, but they do need to do it that. Did someone say Chamorros have a higher BMI? What was it?
Would you happen
What
to know why Chamorros have a higher BMI than Philippines? Is that genetics as well, or we just have more fiestas?
I would say, because Filipinos have more, I would say, and that, I guess maybe I wasn't clear on what I was kind of briefing. I believe that it has more to do with your and the Guam communities colonialism. I'm gonna just be real. I think that the fact that the FDA controls what food is allowed onto the island contributes to the obesity rate. I think that the fact that you all have a community trauma, very much like the African American community in the States, and even when that the keynote speaker was talking about the Native American community, who has a large alcohol and obesity rate also. I think that plays a role. The Filipino community didn't experience the colonization, even though they have had a lot of colonization, but there's still a level of having control of their government, their people. You have control, but then you're occupied by half of the military. And so I think that also plays a role in this collective trauma as a people, that leads to that. I mean, as an African American, obesity is accepted. That's why I was a struggle for me to believe that I had a binge eating disorder. And so I don't think it's because you have more fiestas. I think fiestas help with continuing it because of the food, the caloric calories in the food, because you're getting them from material that's shipped from the States, which has to be all these preservatives and all these other things. I think that plays a role. What's Francis saying? Yes, the transition from local foods to non-traditional. Yes, most definitely. I think that plays a big role. I think the fiestas are good. I think the issue is that because I do believe in bonding and all that, I just think that the food that is supplied in the fiesta, the material is causing that. And I think colonialism is playing a role because you are not allowed to grow your own food, to eat your own food. And so I think that that is something that, and you'll even see that in, yes, processed food. You'll even see that in Hawaii, you know, where I think the obesity rate is high. And so I think that there's a lot to be said about eating foods that are not originated from where you come from. In the African-American tradition, during slavery, we had to eat all the leftovers. Yes, all over Micronesia are diabetic. African-Americans are very much diabetic because we ate the leftovers of what the house, the slave house did. And so I think this also plays a big role. And I think I agree, there needs to be much research. Your thoughts on the use of BMI among, can you read that?
Uh,
I'm
to
sorry, I need
know
my glasses.
what are your thoughts on the use of BMI among the talk, possible, not based in science, about some controversy about using BMI as a measurement of health?
Well, and I don't necessarily agree with the BMI as a measurement of health. I think illnesses and inflammation and I think BMI is a way to blame, to me, this is my opinion, is a way to blame, and it's based on the disparities of health. I think that's a part of it. We don't put culture, we don't put all of those things. You know, I've worked in healthcare for a very long time. And one of the things that I struggle with is the disparities of healthcare amongst people of color. I remember working with many Chamorro men who are very stoic and are not willing to ask for help as much until it gets to the point where their spouses are saying, hey, you need to get help. You know, they're crying, they're upset because some of the trauma that they've seen in Iraq or Afghanistan and in war, and they're so stoic. And so when they go and see a military doctor or a military provider, and if they don't understand the culture or haven't even tried to understand the culture, a lot of times their needs are not met. And so that also, I think, plays a role in why I think the BMI, they need to address a lot of the measurements and the healthcare disparities and the implicit biases of our healthcare providers. Because if we're not aware of our biases, a lot of people get misdiagnosed, misrepresented, and things don't happen. I had a hysterectomy on Guam, and I remember sitting with the doctor and, you know, about my fibroids, and there were other treatments, and I was ready. I was old enough to say no more children, but I think that that plays a role. What happens when there's a childbearing age person that's a little younger coming in? And the first example is we're just going to have a hysterectomy. And so I do think that that plays a role. Kathy said, because our ancestors processed food is good because it cannot spoil for a long time. And that's true. I mean, there is a truth to that. But I live currently in Japan, in Okinawa, which is an island. And I think that they do not eat as much processed food. And they are on an island, and back then, you know, your ancestors didn't know. But now, if you compare Okinawa and Guam, which are very much, you know, Okinawa is a little larger than Guam, their food is not processed because the Japanese government doesn't allow that. And so you have to eat the things fresh. And so there's a difference between, and they eat many fish and seaweed and all those things that are nature based. And so you have to eat it that day. And so I think that going back to those old ways, I think that would help. And then also really sugary drinks. I mean, that was how the majority of my weight came back, was I love my caramel macchiatos and my Coca-Cola. And so I started drinking my calories and started drinking my stress. Luckily, I didn't pick up alcohol. But due to having two addict parents, I kind of stayed away from that. But I did find other things. So thank you so much. Does anybody have any other questions or comments?
We have some comments in the chat. So from Rosario Perez, thank you for your openness in sharing your thoughts. And from Terry Lynn Francisco, she says, excellent and critical research and work, so fundamental for the healing of colonized and oppressed peoples. Thank you, Dr. Burford.
Oh, thank you.
Kathy says, this is a very interesting presentation. Thank you so much, Dr. Burford. I had one comment myself. I thought it was really interesting to see the new life before and after surgery with the mind and body connections.
Mm-hmm.
Like the before where they loved me when I was bigger, and then with after they were like, oh, it's all about me. So I thought that was just really interesting.
Yeah, everybody, can you share your, yes, most definitely. I can share that. I think it's interesting that a lot of people, what I found is a lot of my participants had a place in their family. Even if I can even talk about myself, I was always the biggest in my family. And when I became the smallest in my family, my mother and my sister had a hard time dealing with it. I think part of the reason they had the surgery. And so everybody has a dynamic in their family. And if you're the lovable teddy bear, and the one guy was like, I was a big guy, and my wife didn't know how to handle me getting all these looks, because that's the other thing that happens. You lose a lot of weight, you start feeling confident about yourself, and then you get all these looks. And a lot of times, that is what happens. They don't know what to do with those emotions. This is a part of the affect regulation. Affect regulation isn't just about the sad and unhappy emotions. It's also about the good emotions, right? And so a lot of them struggle with, what do I do with these emotions of being looked at by women that would have never given me a chance, or by men that would never have given me a chance, or and so a lot of them struggle with that. What I see, we have a couple more comments. What are they saying? I'm sorry.
From Sydney, I've watched many shows on obesity, but never made the connection that they revert back after surgery because they were still dealing with trauma. This presentation really helped me to understand. So thank you for informing us and looking into this research.
Thank you. Thank you so much. Yeah, it was a passion of mine. I think that a lot of people, even when you look at the weight loss surgery shows, they don't talk about how their family members are feeding them. If you can't go outside because you're 600 pounds, where are you getting that food from? And what is the function of, it's kind of like the alcoholic whose spouse goes out and gets them the six-pack. What is the function of that relationship? And many of them, suffered sexual assault, sexual abuse, and we don't talk about trauma. We don't talk about even people who grow up in really rough and poverty. Poverty is a trauma in itself. Having storms, typhoons can be very traumatic. And so I think we don't talk about those things. And, and so I think, thank you so much for enjoying my research. I'm happy that you all are enjoying it as much as I have. This is the first time that I've actually been able to talk about it on a larger scale. So I do appreciate all of you. Okay. I wanted to mention the before and after. If you have anyone that has any kind of struggles with that, encourage them to go to therapy. At the end of the day, we're all social workers. And I think that, even though I have my own weight issues, I think that people will learn healthier ways. And this is a part of the psychodynamic, which I think sometimes in social work school, we don't talk about as much in terms of, maybe on the master's level, but we don't talk about how we have to remother or reparent our patients to help them. And so being able to have a partner that has the same motivation, someone talked about, how do you not eat when you're stressed? Well, sometimes having that relational contact, that's why things like AA and NA are important, because it's a relational structure. And so having that a relational, instead of picking up that ice cream cone, calling a friend and talking about what's going on, or having therapy or whatever. And so I think that's one of the ways you can overcome some of the obesity. And then also looking at what you're eating and what you're putting in your mouth. If you're eating a lot of processed foods, maybe replace ice cream with fruit or something that's a little bit more healthier. So, any other questions?
We have a comment
okay.
from Francis.
Mhm.
Reparenting or schema therapy has been very helpful in therapy. Thank you again.
Yes, it is. It really is. And then, like I said, I do think that a movement for Guam is to consider what is in the food that you're getting shipped. There's been studies that McDonald's, the hormones that they use in the McDonald's food is causing early periods in people of color. Hot chips and what's the other thing? And ramen noodles are triggering inflammation of your digestive tract. We're seeing more people with those kind of things. And so definitely the body-mind connection is important. So next slide, this is my references. I want to thank all of you for participating, and it was a good conversation. And just let me know if you would like to reach out to me. I guess I could have put my email, Catherine.
Yes.
Catherine, do they send out the email for my slides, or?
Since did you want to share your presentation with
Yes.
everyone? Okay. So since you said yes, we can download your presentation and be able to email it to all of the participants.
Okay, wonderful. Thank you.
Okay.
Because my
And
goal is to make sure that maybe someone take up this research and do it on Guam. I know we have students in here. And so, everything I think is a foundation. Someone starts something and you add on and make it better. So. All right, I think that's all.
so,
I'll
okay.
let you go a little early.
So we just want to say thank you everyone for
Yes.
participating in this track led by Dr. Xhosa Burford with her presentation of the role of attachment style in weight loss surgery outcomes. So please join us in the main room for the rest of our NASW conference. But before that, we have some information on CEUs. NASW will be offering one CEU for the ethical presentation with Dr. Schwab on day 1 and one CEU for the cultural panel on day 2. This is separate from GLE's one CEU for 10 contact hours. For social work CEU inquiries, please contact Ovida Paris at naswgu@gmail.com. For CEUs with UOG, please contact uog.gle@triton.uog.edu. And I'll put that information in the main chat when we go back to the main room. And since we have extra time left, everyone in this track can leave and participate in the other tracks we have. And yeah, so just be back by 2 o'clock. And that's it.
Thank you very much, everyone.
Thank you, Dr. Burford.